All right, we can probably get started as others kind of join a little later. Looks like we're missing most of the Google team outside of, well, the Google open source security team today, so they might have a conflict. Um, but we can probably get started here. So just as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube at some point after. And also your participation in this meeting is an agreement to abide by the OpenSSF code of conduct. Okay, cool. Well, usually before we start, ask if there's any new folks who want to introduce themselves. Right now there's one new person.
Yes, I can start. So hi everyone, I'm Fredrik Skogman. I'm working with GitHub. So working on the package security team, which is mainly focused around certain areas of supply chain security.
Cool. Cool. Yeah, glad to have you. And in fact, actually, the first item on the agenda is going to be this. So yeah, just as to go through the agenda just very quickly. So the agenda, usually what we've been doing is just kind of having any initial discussions at first, and then we're kind of going through and starting to really try and build a classification and identifying different security tools in the in the space for in the SLSA space. We're also trying to identify gaps, where things hit what level. Is it something that generates the provenance? Is it something that is a builder, that kind of thing? And then identifying where there could be gaps and blah blah, and then figuring out where this team should prioritize. So both from a reach out perspective as well as like a hands-on keyboard. A lot of the folks who join these meetings are also hands-on keyboard engineers, and so where can we actually begin to prioritize some of that as we begin to move towards SLSA 1.0. But first off, wanted to sort of throw it over to you, Fredrik, a little bit to talk maybe a bit about some of the NPM stuff, and based on what we said, maybe anything that kind of related to tooling and that sort of thing.
Sure. So I'm not sure everyone is aware, maybe they are, hopefully they are. But yeah, so this week, this Monday to be exact, we open up an RFC against NPM to offer a way to create SLSA attestations for your NPM builds. And the primary way of doing so for us would be to do it via some CI/CD system. So you would have like total automation for everything, of course. And that has sparked off some really good discussions around this. And obviously for us, big questions that we are, let's say, facing or looking into is exactly how, for instance, the provenance generation would be. So as an example, we have been looking a lot at the GitHub SLSA provenance generator from the Google open source security team. So, and that sort of, I think, ties in as well with some of the discussions in the RFC, like how does this play along with sort of the concept of a trusted builder? So if we look at GitHub Actions, in example, that would be a reusable workflow very similar to the Google open source security team are providing their trusted SLSA provenance generator. So yeah, in short, I think that's where we are. Like there are still some discussions going on and sort of trying to feel like the interest from the community, how it's being received. Like I think Mark also added a comment like we probably should frame it better in terms of what are the exact values that the maintainers are getting, because now it's kind of more focused to the consumer side. So for instance, what value are the NPM users getting by this? Obviously, they're getting value in terms of that they can verify that this packet was built on a sort of automated system, we can sort of cryptographically bind the source code repository to this package, which is not something we can do today. So yeah, a lot of things are happening there, and the only thing I can say so far is like the response has been great. It's a lot of interaction from the community, so I'm really glad. It's, as we have said, like it's kind of pushing the limits of GitHub pull request view. Like it's starting to be a little bit slow sometimes. So super short intro on that. Like I'm happy to discuss more. Like if there are concrete questions. Like I was talking a little bit, maybe I can mention with Michael earlier. Like for instance, we might need to do a better job in terms of advocating SLSA and explaining what it is. I think the RFC might be written in a way that if you don't know SLSA, you might not actually understand what you're actually benefiting from relying on SLSA. So that's at least a personal reflection I have made this week.
Yeah, I was going to make that comment. I didn't make it publicly in a pull request, but I think like probably in the intro, it might be valuable to mention SLSA as like a background, because effectively this is doing SLSA for NPM, right? It's like addressing those threats. I don't think it's like sufficient. I think there's probably more work to do, in particular in policy, which is one of the comments I brought up, and maybe we could talk about that today, like ideas. But it seems, I talked to other folks, Vita's also on the call. We spoke, he and I spoke earlier, and it seems like this is great, necessary foundation. And then like, you know, as the next step, maybe we could have, you know, figure out the policy piece, because the policy piece is challenging.
Yeah, and I think that it has been discussed in the pull request, like probably between you and Philip and potentially some others, like how would we communicate the canonical repository for a given package? Like if it's just, let's say, encoded inside NPM, an adversary that have NPM credentials might actually change that, so it might go undetected. Could we do something TOFU style, like where we only detect changes and alert on that? Or yeah, it's a lot of different questions there, because at least my personal view is like it would be very hard for, let's say, a random consumer to keep track of a list of tuples, package, and source code repository. Does not scale, and it's not sort of something you can do and try to build, you know, policies around that. I think we need to have something more, let's say, centralized or some other way of detecting when something is changing.
Yeah, one. I don't know if we want to get into the details now, so anyone feel free to like say, let's shelve this and move to something else. But one of the things that like Vita and I and others had discussed, and which I mentioned briefly in the pull request, is some, because I think, were you the one who commented? No, someone else. Like the notion of like displaying a warning when the provenance changes. A possible kind of follow on to that could be, for example, putting the expected source repo in the package log file. And so that would effectively say all future updates are expected to come from this repo. And if that changes, that would be a significant event that like effectively you'd have to make another commit to accept, right? Like your team would all be saying, we accept from this repo. You could also imagine an organization, like let's say a large company, as we ingest NPM packages, maybe we have our own mirror. You could do the same thing on every ingest. Like every time you do an update, you make sure that the thing doesn't change. And if it does change, you make, you know, some central team would make a decision of whether it's okay. Because you kind of have the problem of like, you don't want all the developers like having these things. If it happens a lot, it's going to be a useless signal, and you're gonna, you know, it'll just be noise. So you want it to be a rare event. And maybe if we find that it is happening, there could be a way for like safe changes. Like let's say you do move, like you rename your repo. And so that piece of information, or you change providers, you went from like GitHub to GitLab or something like that. If you have control of both, you could maybe have like a pointer or something that like kind of somehow shows like this is a safe thing because the same party controlled both commits, sort of like when you do like those DNS type of verification, like to show that you own a domain, something like that. But anyway, those are just kind of some ideas on how we could do that.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you mentioned the DNS thing, because I think you mean, like, for instance, when you're asked to put up a specific text record with a, let's say, a cryptographic hash. I've had sort of a similar idea in terms of like create this branch, and then you have like a UUID created by the repository, and then you create that branch, and then you can prove that you are sort of in control over the source code repository.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But still, this is a major step, I think. Pizza here.
Yeah, this is awesome. Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot there that I think we should Mark.
So I just putting it to add to the queue. I don't want to interrupt you.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just gonna say, yeah, I mean, I think that there's probably there's some tools that are already actually out there that might be able to help here. There's some tools that I know that are being built out around, some of these things to kind of like, where you might have additional sort of records for these sorts of things, right? Where it's like, hey, we know that this person's in charge, this key is in charge of this repo. So if they sign a thing, then maybe that, hey, it's changed or whatever. There's definitely a lot of things kind of moving along on that end. But I think this is a real concrete use case here that I think as we kind of continue on with some of the stuff that we're looking at, can definitely help sort of shape where the tools should go. That was it. Mark?
I don't remember seeing in the doc, although I admit the doc is long, so I might have missed it. Do you know where the provenance will be stored and how it will be fetched?
Yes, it's deliberately kind of loose on that end because we think it's would create, let's say, too much, put it unnecessary discussions. I think we are more interested now in kind of getting buy-in of the concept. So yeah, for public NPM packages, they will definitely be stored on Record because we will rely on that to publish actually 2 attestations, one build attestation and one release attestation from the registry, pretty much saying, hey, I actually approved publish for this package. Otherwise, we will store the attestation certificate and everything like that in the NPM registry itself. So it could be sort of queried in band as part of getting package metadata. Exactly how we are still kind of working on, because I think the average number of dependencies for an NPM package is 700. So we need to have a pretty efficient way of dealing with that. For instance, hitting record 700 times per dependency would not scale. So, but yeah, we are working on that. And related to that, I opened an issue against Cosign in terms of trying to standardize a format on how to ship DC envelope, certificate, and a record entry together. Because now in Cosign with OCI manifest, you can make it, but that's sort of very tied to container signature and sort of the OCI format. So what I would like to see as well is sort of a format that could be reused across multiple ecosystems. And there is a similar initiative for capturing blog signatures from Cosign. And I think the way we are proposing it, we can actually accommodate for their needs as well. So probably we can have, like, let's say, one more flexible data format for capturing signatures and other data as well coming from Cosign. So our proposal probably will look something like the data format in the issue, and then that would be sort of queryable and postable to the NPM registry. And once we get more traction of this, we will of course make everything public, because we would like other package system as well to be able to implement the same interfaces. So we're not trying to lock down anything like that. It's more like we are trying to get community buy-in as a whole on this, not just from NPM, but also from Sigstore and other players. And the reason, of course, we're putting it in NPM is because, first of all, we are sort of accommodate to the scale, and offline verification is a hard requirement for us.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a good model, also because you don't want to add like another, just for reliability, you don't want to have to add another like failure domain, right? If you're already relying on the NPM storage system, then if you store it there, then you're not having to.
Exactly, and that's for the signing part or the publishing part. It has only been sort of raised as a potential concern, like, hey, you are starting to rely on a third party here to sort of gate publishing. Is that bad? And we don't think it is. Like, public good Sigstore is aiming for 3 nines, if I'm not mistaken, and I think that's sort of pretty good. Like, you can republish it. It's definitely much worse to depend on that during install.
Agreed. I don't know how much time I want to spend here, but one other thing I was just kind of curious about, much longer term, is reproducible builds. I think someone brought it up on the thread on the RFC, because if a significant number of NPM packages are reproducible, then effectively you could like not have to trust any particular vendor, and even you could build it on your local machine and then just have the rebuilds happen on various services. Have you thought about that at all?
We have. There are some complications with how NPM works, in terms of there is no, let's say, strictly defined build command. Instead, you run npm something, and the most common is probably to call it build, but that's sort of a list of various scripts to execute. So it is a bit complicated, and you also have post install hooks, which means that after you have done npm install for a dependency, it can actually execute a script. So yeah, we have thought about it, but I probably can't give you a better answer right now in terms of that. It's complicated, I would say.
Yeah. So I know for at least some packages, it's mostly source in is package out. So for those, I think it's a little easier. But I do think that there's also something that probably needs to make sure that is definitely sorted out in the provenance is those sort of install script pieces, because I know that's kind of one of the common attack vectors is, hey, I run a script, steal your secrets, and
Yes.
And so I think we want to make sure that it's those sorts of things are included in the provenance. So if we ever need to go back and audit, we can go and say, oh, this is weird, this is not the install script I thought it was going to be, or whatever. But separately, I don't want to change topics too much, but I know that one of the things that was also sort of kind of as we started going through there's definitely this thing that's starting to grow in the tool from a tooling perspective for SLSA is how do we start to build this sort of web of trust around builders, right? So like, hey, I probably trust GitHub Actions as a tool to build my stuff. I trust, GitHub has a lot to lose if they're, not secure. Whereas, Mike's personal builder that he's running on his laptop, probably not, right? But at the same time, we might, as this kind of begins to evolve, like there could be also, different open source groups that are like, hey, look, GitHub Actions is not going to work for us because we need builders on ARM and we need builders that do this, that, and the other thing. And this is kind of slightly goes beyond necessarily just purely the NPM thing. But I think NPM thing is sort of opening up the bigger picture for how this might just work for other packages and software in general. So I was wondering if you had sort of given thought of like what federation might look like if, somebody said, great, we'll use GitHub as the OIDC, but we still want to be able to say, great, this system is, represented here as GitHub. Somebody has attested that let's just say service account, it actually represents, as an example, the Linux Foundation's Jenkins build cluster or whatever, right? Have you given any thought of what that sort of thing might look like?
So yeah, I think you're mentioning a few interesting things because our thinking has gone sort of beyond just GitHub Actions. We have kind of thought of in the terms of like, let's say NPM or OpenSSF or whoever it might be, kind of providing a set of, let's say, audited and trusted reusable workflow, which sort of takes it beyond just being able to build on GitHub Actions. You actually have a workflow that you typically won't have access to, and try to sort of think of policies around that. So for instance, NPM or some other organization could say, hey, these 5 reusable workflows in GitHub and these 3 orbs in Circle CI and these reusable pipelines in GitLab, for instance, those are sort of trusted, and NPM officially will only trust those for let's say, if you are adding, let's say, the highest security flag. So that is sort of one way that we have thought about it. Like, and obviously we will sort of work with other providers in terms of creating those sort of reusable build components, whether it might be orb or something else. I think that's sort of the first step that we have been thinking about. I think it's kind of vague in the RFC, but that's sort of what we are probably going to aim for, because I think that simplifies policy writing, because we know sort of these builders are doing sort of the correct things. When it goes beyond that, for instance, as you mentioned, like let's say Jenkins build farm running somewhere, we haven't talked too much in detail right now. We have been kind of focusing around the CI system that sort of are capable of producing their own JSON Web Tokens or OpenID Connect ID tokens, mainly because we are kind of sort of piggyback on the capabilities provided by Folsio. So I think that's sort of where we are now. We are definitely open to more suggestions in terms of, let's say, kind of the example you gave on a Jenkins or some Tecton cluster that's trusted, and we have some entity that's sort of interested in attesting to it in some kind of way. We won't to take the other extreme, we probably won't deny anyone to publish whatever provenance they have. And so, because I still think a lot of the policies will differ for different consumers. For instance, a large corporation might have their reusable workflow managed by their policies in GitHub, and they are trusting that. So I don't think we should take, let's say, too tight or make it too tight, because we can't understand what the customer's policies might look like, but we can aim for open source and say, hey, these are what we think are good builders for running, let's say, a random open source project. But then again, you can override as you wish, because you in the end know what you will trust.
Cool. Yeah. I just wanted to throw that out there because I know one of the conversations from the OpenSSF side is potentially via their Alpha Omega project hosting, let's say, a Tecton cluster or something like that, with the right policies and yada yada, and potentially building open source tools, that something like GitHub Actions is just not adequate for, like some sort of complicated custom sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, the vendoring concept here is obviously something that has been sort of criticized in this pull request. And I think for now, we are kind of looking at what options do we have right now, and what options would we have, let's say, in the near future, which I think would be Circle and GitLab. But looking beyond that, I think at least I personally can't say anything, but hopefully, we can make it sort of a much more, let's say, compelling stories, or a compelling story here going forward.
Cool. Mark?
Yeah, I think it kind of circles back to in my mind, the reproducible build thing, that if there is concern around, having to trust any one vendor. I think reproducible builds and establishing a convention around that seems like a promising path. I don't know if anyone's done like research on like in practice how many packages are reproducible. I know we did some for Python, and of the top 100 by download, someone was able to reproduce like a good fraction, like 70% or something like that,
Yeah.
which is a pretty big chunk. And that's like with no work at all from the maintainer side. So if there's like a large number of ones that are trivial, as Michael said, or like straightforward, or like use standard tools, or ones where like the maintainer is like super like, oh, I don't want to use any, a commercial vendor. If they put in the work to make it reproducible, it's probably worth considering as a way specifically to address the concerns around vendorization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing that we have sort of discussed briefly is that, yeah, I mean, you have, let's say, install scripts or sort of post install hooks, and you have other things that can execute as part of a build. We have just have like super brief discussions in terms of like, is the problems generator somehow could sort of intercept and potentially attest that this package did not run any, let's say, script coming from outside of the repository, as an example. We haven't sort of got into the weeds yet, but kind of discussing like, would that be possible? Would that something we can rely on and potentially sort of add some information that is signed that could be trusted? And I think that would help sort of taking it to a state where it can be reproducible, buildable.
Yeah, actually, that was something I was just about to ask there, because like I think when it came to reproducible builds, it's always been about the package, but if the package itself on installation is not necessarily deterministic, right? Like it could be doing an unbounded set of things on installation. That could obviously, I think that's an interesting one to sort of think about, because yeah, a lot of package managers just sort of say, yeah, no, you can only install these files in these places, and that's all it does. And then I know for good use cases, like, hey, npm maybe goes out and also does like a GCC and compilation of another thing, or pulls down some other files that don't necessarily belong literally part of the npm package, but still are required. But then in addition to that sort of thing is then often abused as a way to sort of like, hey, let's look at what's in .ssh and so yeah, I think that's an interesting thing that I don't think we had considered in SLSA, of like, what if the artifact that's being built itself, if it's, let's say, a package, if that sort of does, if its installation isn't can't be reasoned about easily.
Yeah, and that's something I think we probably should start to take sort of to discussion to the npm CLI team as well, to kind of see what's happening there. Like, are there something from their perspective that they can do, for instance? But yeah, I'm not aware of any, let's say, real discussions happening here yet. So I mean, it's super new, even though we have obviously worked for it before we put it on this Monday. But yeah, I think, or I hope at least, we will see a lot of things happening in the npm ecosystem going forward.
Quick follow-up on the earlier question around like certification of builders. Part of the RFC was around having like some sort of verified badge within the website. Would that, and you also said like people could upload whatever provenance. I fully support that. Actually, I fully support both things. Is the notion that NPM would maintain some list of builders that get the verified badge, and other ones would basically just be called unverified or something like that?
I can't give you let's say, complete or authoritative answer here. But my intention or my understanding is that if we see a provenance from something trusted by, let's say, Fulcio, we give you this verified badge. It doesn't have to come from, let's say, a trusted builder or a reusable workflow. It's more like if we see signed provenance by an authority we trust, we give you the signed badge. That's my understanding, but I'm not 100%.
Yeah, because like the part of SLSA is having, it's not a Boolean thing, but a system of levels of like how trustworthy it is. And so that's maybe something to think through a bit more of, like what level, like is it, if it's just signed by anyone with an OIDC that provides an OIDC token, is it something where there's some like guarantee that it can't be forged and is somehow level 3? I also, by the way, filed a GitHub issue in the SLSA repo asking whether we would consider like effectively the option 1 where the NPM client does the generation of the provenance, whether that would meet SLSA 3 or not.
Yeah, I think it's the same issue I responded to this morning.
Earlier today.
Yeah. So yeah, that is, I think it's an interesting sort of topic to bring up. And our thinking has been very much around kind of what you mentioned, like how would the provenance be generated? And for instance, would you be able to falsify something of it? And yeah, I think it resonates very well with sort of this signed badge, because if we are too, let's say, sloppy in terms of verification of that, it might give the consumers a false sense of security because they're seeing this badge. And like, let's say the difference between SLSA level 2 and SLSA level 3 is something we have kind of discussed as well, because our intention was to take it to SLSA level 3, but my personal opinion is that we as NPM or GitHub cannot attest because of the flexibility in the NPM build commands. We can give you the platform and you as a maintainer can say, hey, here's the proof that my repository does only, let's say, build from sources inside the repository. So I can say we are SLSA free by virtue of this thing being signed by GitHub, but GitHub maybe only takes it to, let's say, SLSA 2 or something like that. But they sort of would have to go the extra miles to sort of prove it, because probably we can't do it with the current state of NPM ecosystem today, because like NPM install could do a bunch of script execution, and so can building the thing. So I think that's sort of where our reasoning are right now. It's something we are kind of discussing almost weekly, I would say.
Thanks.
Cool. Any other questions? Otherwise, or topics regarding that? Otherwise, we can kind of move on to some of the gap identification stuff, as well as sort of just identifying where we should be prioritizing. All right, cool. Cool. So a lot of good stuff there. So let me just quickly share my screen here. So just for those who are new, or those just as a reminder, we've been sort of filling out sort of current tooling and gaps. Looks like Naveen isn't on, but he was going to sort of, I believe, start to create kind of like a mapping for some of this stuff, so that we can start to kind of see, one is we have different categories of tools, build in production, distribution and discovery, verification and decisioning. So that's kind of like the policy stuff. We also wanted to kind of maybe just highlight some of the training, or push on the other tool providers to provide more as far as like getting started. And then also different things like, other tooling that is related, but not necessarily directly in Salsa. So stuff like, hey, SBOM, if we're, let's say, assuming we're keeping the 2-person PR at some level, hey, what sorts of things like from that end, like how do we verify that, those sorts of things, some other tools there. And then also like what are tools that currently exist today that especially builders that might be that might have gaps or are otherwise potentially big tools like Jenkins, and like, hey, Jenkins is still not going away, so have folks thought about this? I believe I was at some meeting or other, I think it was at the CD Foundation, somebody is making a couple of Jenkins plugins to try and track Salsa provenance. There's some open questions because of Jenkins' sort of security model, whether like how much they can kind of get there, but that's something that's being sort of discussed. And there was like, BuildBot was another one. But if other folks have additional tools, feel free to put in there. And next week, hopefully we'll have some sort of better mapping, whether it's in a Google Sheet or actually, I guess we're going to push it into GitHub. But yeah, so we have a bunch of tools here. We've been identifying some of the gaps. Want to kind of continue through, identify maybe some more gaps, and maybe just identify where some folks wanted to focus their effort on. Sound good? Anything? And yes, Mark, yeah, I believe it was somebody from Samsung. Yeah. Cool. And I do think the NPM use case in particular helps sort of ground where we're kind of coming out of some of this. Any, like, if reading through the current tooling and gaps, anybody see any sort of gaps that they want to highlight? I am seeing that probably it's worthwhile to say service versus software, where some of these things like all right. Oops. Okay. Feel free to add stuff as well, but so probably makes sense to split this up into both service and software, because some of these things are, hey, the GitHub generator only works on GitHub Actions, so well, I guess it could work potentially on actually, I don't know enough about GitHub or GitLab Enterprise or any of that sort of stuff. GCB. Cool. Any other sorts of things, any other categories or gaps or anything like that? Otherwise, we can move straight to prioritization.
I just added links to the two open issues that I think addresses this specific concern around not being able to send certificate and attestation together with it.
Format design into it. Oh, so yes.
Yeah, this one I think you're aware of.
Yeah. So just for that one, hopefully by early next week, we'll have fixed the recore bug, which right now there's a bug in Record that doesn't actually, if you have an attestation, it doesn't actually include the signature with the attestation. It includes the key and it includes like essentially a stamp that, hey, this was signed, but it doesn't actually include the signature, which makes, unless you're literally keeping the signature alongside the package, which obviously that's the ideal situation. But if you're not, there's no way to actually verify it from the Record side. So that should hopefully be fixed by Parth is still on, by mostly Parth in the next couple of days. And then
that is when you're sending, when you're sending a DC envelope with the total attestation. Yes.
Yep. So that should hopefully be sorted out. And then in addition to that, there is a pull request that I've had open since January that also actually adds that as a cosign command. So you could do like cosign attest blob, and it will output it as a file as well as output it to Recore. But we've been waiting for some of the Recore stuff to get sorted out first. So yeah, that should hopefully be coming in the next figure next week or so. Cool. So what was the other thing?
Other gaps or areas. Should there be a category on, I don't know if this is tooling or like adoption, but like integration into systems like NPM? Or
yes, actually, I think we had that kind of like, oh, I thought we had that somewhere.
Like there's the verification and decisioning.
Yeah, there's, I mean, we could just put integrations or here. Well, is that more of like package management or
integration into like package managers?
Yeah. Well, actually, hold on. Like, is that more? Does it make sense to just say, sort of say consumption? Well, yeah, I'll just put.
Because like one thing is, I've been thinking of like there's the build support, distribution of provenance and root and discovery and root of trust and all those things.
Oh, right.
Reaching into the package manager and then verification at use time. Like Kubernetes is kind of fundamentally different than integration NPM because NPM is about one specific package, whereas Kubernetes is like an environment of where multiple packages are used.
Yeah. And it probably maybe makes sense to sort of maybe have it stated both ways then, like, hey, one is OCI, but then one is the tools that consume OCI. And so one is like NPM as the package manager, one is NPM as a package registry might contain this information. And then the other is the tooling that can then pull that down and verify. Or do you think that we should just sort of take this and move it down to something like package integration?
I don't know. I guess it depends on how you cut it. Because like part of it is like just distributing the provenance, but part of it is like doing the checks, right? And like verifying it and having some sort of policy. So I didn't quite know what the companion file meant. I originally just interpreted that as just storing the provenance without actually doing anything with it necessarily. Sean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think again, when we're talking about the package managers, I think it would be really useful to have a generic discovery mechanism for attestations, because we don't really want every package ecosystem to have to implement that for themselves. If there is a general public record that we can use of SLSA attestations for artifacts, it makes more sense for them to integrate against that than it does for everyone to generate their own mechanism for doing that. And so, yeah, I think I'd like to try and focus on well, as I said before, try and focus on discoverability for attestations before we kind of charge into doing attestation verifications in package managers.
So yeah, there's a couple of things there. One is ideally, like, just to be clear, like ideally we should have package managers that can support it, but I do think that it's not a deal breaker, and it's also not necessarily like something we should, you know, rely on in the short term, right? Because like as multiple people kind of pointed out in the comments, it just makes a lot of things easier if like, hey, when I pull down the package, I'm also pulling down the associated attestation. I don't need to make a bunch of different requests. But with that said, some of us between Google, Kusari, Purdue University, and some other folks are building some of that out now to kind of like go through, scan Recore, scan OCI and package registries, pull all of those attestations into something that is queryable. So you can maybe make some of those requests, and then also do stuff like, hey, I pulled in the package, and maybe the package is like essentially like a flat pack and it's everything. Cool, I pulled in an attestation for the actual building of the flat pack, and then I pulled in attestations transitively for all the things that pulled in, you know, and included in there, which could be useful, but I think that's going to take some time to build out. Mark?
Yeah, I feel like both are valuable. In my head, I had been thinking that we probably want to have generic things that you could just bolt on without any integration into the packaging ecosystem. Because like you could show value and you could progress without having to get like them on board, and you could kind of prove out ideas without actually making like major changes. But then we will also want, I think, an integration into all the ecosystems, because without that, I don't think you could get like the reliability and security you need. Like we talked about before, like having provenance stored within NPM is valuable for a reliability perspective, because like you don't have to rely on this like additional service. That said, I think having the same model and like reusing as much as possible between them is totally desirable, but I'm not sure that like you could just only have like, for example, attestation discovery outside of the ecosystem.
I think that's true, but yeah, I'd like, you know, even if it's just a specification of where a companion file lives respective to its to the actual package. I mean, that might be enough to start with, is just saying, okay, if you have an attestation for a given package, it will be called this and it will be co-resident. If that would be enough to get started and get all the package managers kind of able to do something fairly straightforward straight away. And so we can start the experimentation that way. We could just say, if you've got a package called nokogiri.gem, your attestation will be called nokogiri.intoto.jxml, and it will be in the same directory. So something like that, and we could just make that kind of not even a standard, just a proposal. People could start integrating against that, and package managers could start using it. So it doesn't have to be, you know, this big glorious transaction log. It could just be, this is where the files live, and if you want the attestation for a package, this is where you find it.
That makes sense.
In the linked issue, or that we talked about, where we were talking about how to distribute certificate Recore bundle and the DIS envelope, I kind of alluded to as well, like I think the follow-up on that should probably be to sort of define, or try to at least define like a query model for it, so we can have sort of good interoperability between different package managers, so each one doesn't look and feel the same, sort of look and behave very differently. Because I think in the end, the actual transactions are most likely fairly trivial. For instance, upload something against a specific SHA digest, download, here's a list of SHA digests where I would like to see attestations for. So I think in the end, it shouldn't be too controversial to try to define or standardize an API around it as well.
Sense. Okay. Anything else, just sort of generally, any other big sort of categories or big things that folks think are missing that we should address? Okay, so now I guess we can, with the rest of the time, we can just sort of go over maybe where people want to focus their time on, or if there's anything that, like, and to be clear, like outside of like where should this group focus its efforts on right now is kind of the goal here, right? Like a lot of us are kind of probably related to some of these projects at some level or another. But where do folks think is like just generally like, hey, this is a big gap, and as we move towards 1.0, it has to be addressed?
I guess I don't feel strongly here. My inclination for a big gap would be, well, I don't know how much effort, let's say, it takes, but would be the packaging ecosystem thing. Like it's great that NPM is effectively kind of going first and setting an example. For the builders, we have an example, like the GitHub Actions thing of like, here's how we could do it. And then so that allows us to kind of replicate. We don't yet have an implementation of like how this would work in a real packaging ecosystem. And so that I think is a kind of a big gap, particularly around the policy piece, because even in the RFC, that it doesn't really address that piece of like, how do you ensure that it's built from the right source repository? That, I don't know if that's, to me, in my mind, that is the biggest gap that's like unclear of how it would work.
Yeah, I would probably be inclined to agree that sort of the story around verifying it's the canonical repository for this package it's a big issue for us. Like as we mentioned earlier, what I think the best we can do is say this is, let's say, a trusted builder by NPM, and so you can at least trust it. But is it actually, let's say, the canonical repository for it? Yeah, we can't really tell you about that yet.
So just to kind of maybe quickly go through then. So, I mean, it does sound like for the most part, we have a lot of stuff from the build and production side that can at least generate SLSA provenance relatively reliably. There might be a couple of gaps here and there on exactly what level these things can reach, but that seems to be maybe doesn't sound like potentially a huge priority then, compared to maybe some of the stuff here around, like a lot of folks are mentioning, hey, if I can't discover the provenance, you know, if I don't know where the provenance lives, then or if I don't have access to the provenance or whatever, how good is it for me? Like what good is it to me? So it sounds like maybe something like this is important, as especially with, and then some of the other things I think are related, like that's been kind of brought up before, is like, how do I know what identities I should be trusting? There's potentially that sort of like web of trust as well, of like, hey, you know, if it's going through, let's say, NPM, here are maybe certain things that some, you know, I'm just going to, you know, like, here are the 100 core packages that NPM itself is saying, hey, we think they've done the right things, or somebody, a third party, Google says, yep, we think they did the right things, or something like that. I don't know how we want to like kind of like, I think that sort of thing is a big gap of like, how do we describe that? And how do we kind of talk through the, you know, how do we sort of figure some of those things out? For the verification piece, I know that there is a good deal of like policy managers, or sorry, you know, admission controllers, policy managers that are starting to do these sorts of things, but that can also go in and like a lot of these can arbitrarily read JSON. So you're just like, okay, great, I have an attestation. Here's a, you know, here's this thing, and I can look at, you know, here are the list of trusted builders, and assuming that the person on the other side is not lying to me, then, you know, if I see that it was built with this builder and I trust it, okay, that's something that I include in. The thing that I'm seeing, actually, maybe that's a gap then, and keep me honest here, is this sort of like how it integrates then with the package ecosystem of, if I want to run npm install, I should be able to have, you know, and I don't honestly remember the npm config file, but like my global npm config file might have a policy associated with it saying, hey, you know, like only look for things that have SLSA 2 and that have these list of trusted builders. Otherwise, don't allow it to install. And I don't think that sort of thing is really kind of being addressed here. And some of the stuff in here are like, I think a lot of the things in here, at least, are very specific to sort of like, you want to install something to Kubernetes. Okay, cool. This is how we look. We'll pull down the container, and this is how we look at it, and so on. So that seems to be a big gap. And then the other stuff I think is, you know, we don't need to really worry about right now. Mark?
Yeah, it seems like the coming back to use cases, if we think about, there's like third party, particularly open source use cases, and then first party. A lot of the things there, like Kyverno and Gatekeeper, are more, if I understand, focused on first party code of like, how do I ensure that my code was built according to my processes, and you kind of know what the policy is. Whereas with a packaging ecosystem, and maybe that's one way to slice it, is more around the like a third party code of like, I don't even know what the source repository was supposed to be, and how do I manage trust from like all these other external parties. So
Yeah.
The third party / open source case is where we need more focus.
Yeah, so I think
my inclination right now.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I will sort of caveat a little bit of that. Like, so Kyverno can still be used, for example, if people are publishing their let's say in OCI, they're publishing their images in OCI, and their attestations in OCI. You can say, great, here are the list of keys I trust. Like, so for example, we do this with Fresca, right, where we say we trust code coming from the Tecton team signed by the Tecton key, right? And so we don't allow, like, if we pull in a random Tecton and it's not signed by the Tecton team, you know, we don't actually run that, even though it's technically third-party code. And so we can do that a little bit there, but I think you do bring up a good point, because there's also stuff of, hey, if I'm running npm, there's going to be separate policy for, here is npm code that I published internally for my own internal package registries versus here's stuff that's coming from the open source or, you know, vendors or whatever. Cool. So we're already at time, but I think we have a pretty good priority, unless there's any objections, which is if we have that there. Yeah, the package ecosystem, policy integration, provenance, distribution, discovery, you know, and I'll just put particularly around open source ecosystem. I think that makes sense. And then next week we can probably figure out, like, if there's specific tools or things that we need to add features to, and so on. Make sense? Awesome. See you all next week. Have a good weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Nice meeting you all. Have a good weekend.